What happens to your body when you squat 100 times every day? One of the best exercises is the squat. The internet is replete with images and videos that demonstrate the profound transformations people experience with daily squats. I'll explain in this video what occurs to your body when you perform squats regularly. So be sure you watch the entire video. Now let's move. To start, there are several kinds of squats. You can squat using your weight or with the help of extra weights, such as a barbell on your shoulders or dumbbells in your hands. Another exercise is the squat jump. Still, the majority of those who want to squat do so in a traditional manner, squatting to the point when their thighs are parallel to the floor, their legs are either shoulder-width apart or slightly broader. Which muscles are used when performing squats? The hips and buttocks are most likely the first thing that comes to mind. There are a ton of muscles if you start listing them. These include the quadriceps muscle, the biceps muscle, the semitendinosus and semimembranosus muscles of the thigh, and the gluteus maximus, minimus, and medius muscles. The rectus abdominal muscle, the adductors, the hip flexors, the oblique abdominal muscle, the transverse abdominal muscle, and the spinal erectors. This kind of exercise involves using half of the body. The first thing you'll notice, then, is that all those muscles I just mentioned will get stronger. That is the abs as well as the legs. Squats have an impact on muscular development. It will become apparent. The muscles will start to protrude. This explains the abundance of before and after pictures showing people's transformations. For instance, squats affect muscular growth and will also change the way you look, whereas jogging and cycling have very little influence on this. As a result, in only 1 month, folks who have never played sports before but have challenged themselves to squat every day will see noticeable improvements in their looks. Pictures taken before and after will show how much has changed. The second effect is weight loss. Since squats are a substantial physical activity, do them every day. The metabolism quickens and the body takes in more calories. As a result, folks who squat not only gain strength but also generally get leaner and lose fat. The enhancement of blood circulation and fortification of the cardiovascular system is the next noteworthy benefit. Because we are using our legs in this form of exercise, the tone of the heart muscle will rise, blood flow to the heart and its surrounding areas will improve, and the circulation of blood from the veins in the lower body will also considerably improve. The next point, squats helps us to improve posture. Naturally, there's a catch, only if we carry things out correctly. Straight back with a little inclination in the lower back, not crooked. Squats, as I said before, develop the muscles in our lower backs, which will improve our posture. The second benefit is that squats will improve your endurance since they improve lung capacity, regulate and coordinate breathing, and have a significant impact on the respiratory system's function. When we inhale, we descend, and when we exhale, we ascend. This is the foundation of every strength training program. When we exhale, we exert every effort, and when we inhale, we rest. Squats will therefore be advantageous for both our respiratory system and general endurance. The next item is the mobility of your hips and ankles. The truth is that performing squats daily will greatly increase your limb mobility. And well-executed squats can help cure knee and lower back discomfort if it is caused by a sedentary lifestyle. As I mentioned before, squats work the core in addition to the legs. The core is the muscles of the abdomen and lower back. Thus, squats will work them out wonderfully, particularly with the addition of weights of some type. Using proper form is crucial if you want to squat with a barbell on your shoulders because it's a very easy activity to perform incorrectly. Exercises as risky as squatting with a barbell on your shoulders should only be performed under the guidance of a qualified coach or seasoned athlete who can demonstrate the proper form and point out any mistakes you may have made. However, there are some less harmful alterations, including squat leaping. Therefore, this kind of squat will effectively work our core. This occurs because our cycle requires the engagement of our body's stabilizing muscles, and you will find great utility in the robust core. For instance, as a means of lowering the danger and avoiding back problems. Of course, something has to be said about the many squat forms. So, the first type is the classic squat. We position our arms across our bodies and our legs shoulder-width apart. When we exhale, we go back to the beginning posture after taking the pelvis back and bending our knees to a right angle. The next type is the plie squat. The gluteal muscles are emphasized a lot more. We retain our hands above the waist, stretch our legs far wider than the breadth of our shoulders, bend our knees to a straight angle, and turn our socks outward. The next type, which I have already talked about, is the squat with a jump or a squat jump. Sprinter runners or those who play football professionally, for example, Employ these workouts to practice accelerating and running swiftly. Similar to the basic squat, we begin by putting our legs shoulder-width apart and squatting forcefully to leap. And we quickly start squatting again the moment our feet make contact with the ground. Friends, please share how you squat in the comments section. Or perhaps you simply intend to begin squatting. It would be interesting to read about your experience if you shared it in the comments. I also recommend you to watch other videos on my channel. Links are on the screen now. If you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. See you in our next video.